right now, is the Republican Party the party of Trump? Is the Republican Party MAGA? What is the Republican Party? We talk about being Reagan Republicans. How are we defining the Republican Party? And that's where I think it's better, instead of taking the label, define your values. And then you interpret where I fit. What a concept.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. This Christmas morning, we have a guest who really needs no introduction, US Senator Lisa Murkowski. Our conversation today is framed around her book that came out last summer, Far From Home. An Alaskan senator faces the extreme climate of Washington, D.C. And although much of what we speak about today is from the book, we also discuss her vote on H.R. 1, referred to by the president as the One Big Beautiful Bill. We talk about her concerns about the new uses of the National Guard and the insurrection that happened on January 6, 2021. Senator Lisa Murkowski, Merry Christmas and welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club podcast.
It is so good to see you live and in person, and Merry Christmas to you.
Thank you.
Great on a sunny, gorgeous day.
Very grateful to talk about your book, Far From Home. I didn't know what to expect when I read the book, but I think in part, I expected it to be for a nationwide audience. And very early in the book, talking about former Alaska State House Minority Leader Beth Kurtula's couch, and you...
Wait, it was my couch.
Oh, it was your couch. She said it was her dad's couch.
It was her dad's couch.
Yeah.
It was her dad's. It was his... Yeah, there's some history there. That's pretty local.
I was like, this is written for Alaskans. And I assume that you and your co-writer, Charles Wolforth, made a decision that you weren't going to over-explain who all these people were, and that there was going to be just an expectation that Alaskans would be reading the book.
Yes and no, because as I have talked with Alaskans who read the book, they share the same thing, that it was like, oh man, it was so good to reread again, whether it was the story about what had gone on with Ted Stevens, all of that, or parts of the legislative debate that was going on. And yet I talk to people who have read the book who are not Alaskans, who are perhaps from more the Washington, D.C. subset there. And they're like, man, you wrote this book for, anybody who's ever been following any of the politics in Washington, D.C. So I know that Charles and I didn't start this project by saying this is going to be a book for Alaskans. This is going to be a book on Alaskan history. But neither did we say this is going to be a book about the intrigue of Washington, D.C. politics. It was more just a book about how a person like me, who he says, I always called you a reluctant senator, didn't envision myself, didn't grow up thinking that this was what I was going to end up doing. And it was more designed to just tell the story about an Alaskan who has been shaped by her state, who ends up in Washington, D.C. at a very interesting political time. It's the Alaska parts of it are the best parts in my view. They were the parts that I had most fun with.
They are. It's interesting because talking to some of your staff, they had mentioned that they were most interested in the Alaska parts because they already knew the national parts. But for me, as an Alaskan reading it, I actually didn't pay that close attention to the minutia of the Kavanaugh hearings, of all these big national issues. So I actually was surprised and learned a lot from the national sections.
See, it came together in a way that I don't think I had anticipated it would. And I think part of that was when I first started out, when I said, I want to write a book, it was because of the 2010 write-in election. And so in my head, that's what it was all about. But by the time we'd written that, there was so much that was happening on the national scene that it was hard to stop writing.
And that's really interesting. You write about that, I think, in the epilogue, that it wasn't so much looking back, but it was almost like reporting in real time. You were reporting in real time during COVID, January 6th. All of that was very much reporting in the present.
Yeah, it was. And so I think you see maybe a lot more detail in terms of how I was actually thinking about this because it was so fresh. It was so, to use your words, in real time. And the way that we collaborated with this, there were some sessions when I would get on a train and go up to New Jersey where Charles and his wife live, and I'd spend the weekend with them, and we would just talk. We'd sit in his office and we would talk for hours and hours. And then there was a lot of times when at the end of the day, I would just talk into my phone on a voice memo and just literally process what had gone on that day. And I saved those. So it was like archived material, but it was pretty fresh. There was some that I think you look at in the early chapters of the book where the details are perhaps not as immediate as you see in the latter part of the book.
I want to talk about the title, your subtitle, An Alaskan Senator Faces the Extreme Climate of Washington, D.C. And that word climate is there. Climate change really is a thread through the entire book. You talk about your visit to Newtok and the relocation of the community and the decades of work that entailed. But I'm going to have you do one reading today. I want you to read all of page 126 because I think that it encapsulates the almost tightrope walk that you have to do as who you are in this moment in time, particularly to do with climate change.
Mother Jones ran a takedown headlined, Lisa Murkowski, Climate Change Double Agent. I'm not aware of a similar article about the more than 40 Republican senators who denied or ignored the problem. I've received this sort of criticism many times. Unfortunately, it's common to feel that those who agree with you have the legitimate reasons for their views, while those who disagree are misinformed or dishonestly motivated. I'm often applauded for voting my conscience when I side with the Democrats, only to be condemned by the same liberals as a sellout when I side with the Republicans. I want to tell these people, I am voting my conscience, not your conscience. Politically, my path is a hazardous one. It's human nature to take for granted those who agree with us. Naturally, she agrees with the correct point of view, while being strongly opposed to those who disagree. Something must be wrong with her since she supports something that is wrong. The clannish partisanship of our current politics exacerbates this narrow-mindedness, as it encourages us to see those who disagree as enemies rather than trying to understand their genuine motivations. When I do the hard work of taking each issue on its merits, I rely on Alaskans to do something hard as well, to pay serious attention to my reasons, or, more likely, to trust me and believe that I really am who I say I am, with their best interests at heart. The latter also keeps me honest, as trust like that is hard won and easily lost. In Washington, I'm more often misunderstood. When I vote contrary to expectations, people look for an explanation in the context of the Washington they understand. What transactional deal did I make? What lobbyist or interest was I trying to please? The answer is none. Unfortunately, explaining my real reasons doesn't always help. Cynical insiders know not to believe the phony rationales politicians give for their votes. I understand why voters no longer believe politicians, but I feel frustrated that an honest explanation isn't good enough to convince them.
Thank you. It says a lot.
It is, you use the word, it's the tightrope. And it is true that you have those who are so excited to support you because they have seen that you have been there for them on a position that may go against your party. And they celebrate it. And then on the next issue, they feel like you've sold yourself out. Why? Because you voted in a way that was consistent with who you are, where you're from.
And on this issue, you have, unlike many of your colleagues, have said that climate change is real, that humans have contributed, that it is something that we must address. And then at the same time, have fought hard for Willow, fought hard to reopen Anwar, And I think for a lot of folks, it's really hard to hold both of those in their heads at one time.
I think it is. This is where, again, when you're anchored in a place like Alaska, when you see that we are a state where today it's really pretty cold around here, people aren't talking about climate change right here, but our reality is we are seeing the impacts of climate change, and it is visual, it is tangible, and it is real. But we also come from a place where our resource base is what has helped to sustain us. And so as we are here on this land, we can't live here unless we have the opportunity for some level of economic development, the jobs that come with it, and how we utilize our land is up to us. We do it irresponsibly at our peril, and I won't accept that irresponsible use. That's why I say it's going to cost you more to develop in the North Slope if you want to access that oil wealth. It's going to cost you because we're going to make sure that the environmental regulations are strong enough that they're going to protect our environment. They're going to allow for responsible use, responsible stewardship. But it's a balancing thing. It's not an either or. And I think that's hard for some people because they want you to make a choice. It's either one or the other, but you can't have both. I think you can, but there's special considerations that come with accessing it.
This book came out, I believe, on June 24th, 2025. And you had been in the works since the election in 2010 with the write-in campaign. You had no idea that you'd be voting on House Resolution 1, the big, beautiful bill, a few days later. I imagine that if you'd known that, you maybe would have timed the book release differently.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We timed the book release. I don't know anything about publishing books, but apparently you want to have books come out before the summer read. I didn't know that. Makes sense. And so we were actually shooting for the Memorial Day recess time period, but the publishers wanted a block of time where I was going to be able to go do interviews up in New York and in other places. And it needed to be at a time where I could give 4 or 5 days to just like shop the book. And I don't have 4 or 5 days in my job. And so we literally broke it up and we pushed the date as long into June as we could, and thinking that was going to allow for the right amount of pre-promotion. But yeah, you want to get sucked out of the news cycle, go ahead and throw a reconciliation bill on top of it, particularly given the role that I played in it.
Well, with the reconciliation bill, I think there's a lot of folks who had just read this passage about what transactional deal did you make? What lobbyists or interests were you trying to please? And I would be remiss if I didn't have a moment for you to just remind folks why you voted the way you did on that bill, which what I heard from some folks was that even if you got good things for Alaska, were you selling out the rest of the country in order to get these good things or things that wouldn't affect Alaska as much?
At the end of the day, all you can do is the best that you can for the people that you're serving. And this bill, a reconciliation bill, was going to pass the United States Senate. You had a Republican president and you had a Republican House and a Republican Senate. We were going to get a reconciliation bill. And so I told my team from day one way or another, we have to be in shaping the contours of this. And you see my fingerprints over a lot of the resource development pieces that are incorporated in it, Coast Guard. There are some things that significantly help and benefit Alaska. The area that was of real concern to me was how the House had proposed to do the pay-fors, which was on the Medicaid side. And that was hard, and that needed to be addressed. And we worked every which way to Sunday to try to get it to a better place. And believe me, my staff was working as hard as anybody possibly could right up until the very end. And we were not in a good place on the Medicaid side, despite everything else that was in the bill. And I was going back and forth, and I basically told the leadership, I can't get there. I can't have this situation that's going to jeopardize so many in my state. And it was pretty clear that they were willing to help soften the blow to Alaskans with the Medicaid piece, working with me to double the Rural Health Transformation Fund, working with me on the provisions to the workforce requirements, both for Medicaid and for SNAP. There were some significant pushbacks on the time to give Alaska sufficient time to get up to speed with meeting the requirements. But it was also made very clear that they needed my vote. And if they weren't able to get my vote, they were getting the vote from my colleague, Senator Paul. And his view of how we deal with Medicaid was entirely different than mine. And as I look back on what Alaskans were able to receive as a result of some of the concessions that I got from leadership on that, my alternative would have been to vote against the bill, send a strong message that I didn't support it, even though there are many provisions in it that I do support, only to have a final bill that would have really been punitive towards Alaska. And I can't live with that. And there are those who say you got a better deal for Alaska at the expense of others. But what I will point out is there is no provision that Alaska gained benefit on our own. For instance, with the Rural Health Transformation Fund, all 50 states benefited. With regards to pushback on the work requirements, there are multiple states, Hawaii, and many of these provisions. The provisions that we were able to incorporate on the SNAP, again, I think 17 other states. So it was not just Alaska. But I know that's what people want to believe. And again, at the end of the day, I have to be accountable to Alaskans. I know that there were many Alaskans who were disappointed because they thought that I could kill it. And if I thought that I could kill it and we would live to fight another day, at least on the Medicaid side, that might have been a different story. But it was a bill that was going to be signed into law. The question was whether or not I was going to be able to address a significant number of the concerns that Alaskans had. And I was.
I also know that there were some increases to different parts of the budget in the reconciliation bill, including a big increase to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Department, also called ICE. As chair of Joint Armed Services Committee, I've been looking at the way the National Guard is being deployed around the country. I have concerns about that as well.
You know, I am one who is just exceptionally proud of the Guard and all that they do. You know, the governor is saying basically we're gonna free up 100 Alaska Guard folk for deployment in DC or elsewhere. And then you see things like what we saw in Western Alaska with the typhoon, and you see these people in action. But we are asking a lot of our guardsmen. I was visiting with Joni Ernst last week, and Iowa lost 2 of their guardsmen. They're over in Syria. We're deploying our guardsmen and women in different ways than we ever had. And they have families and they have jobs. And when we have demands that are going on in the state, they are there and they're going to rally. But this whole idea that we're now turning them into like a free branch to be used for law enforcement, trash cleanup, it's just something that I don't know if the legislature is even thinking about asking some of these questions.
Yes. So at my JASC hearing on November 12th, we had 2 former West Point JAGs testifying about legal ways of using the Guard. And one of them was very blunt that there are illegal things in terms of the way the Guard is being used. in his opinion, he's a law professor, but in his opinion, illegal ways that the Guard is being used. And the Supreme Court just ruled that they have to pull out of Illinois.
But it's one thing if the governor of Illinois says, we don't want these Guards people from Texas. But what happens if your Republican governor says, I'm freeing up these people to go to D.C. because D.C. is different than somebody else, than a state.
Well, and D.C. is different. And I think the supplementing ICE and Anchorage to state that they would only be doing administrative tasks and inspecting fire extinguishers, these things that are non-controversial jobs. But why does ICE need guardsmen? They have a $50,000 incentive bonus.
The plus up we gave to ICE this summer in the reconciliation bill was huge. It was like mind-blowing. So ICE doesn't need this.
We talk about you a lot. We held a JASC meeting in Fairbanks in August. Every time I do a little history lesson. This committee was created by, at the time, Alaska State House Representative Lisa Murkowski. My interpretation of you creating JASC was it was an opportunity for the legislature representing Alaskans to give feedback to DOD. It wasn't just so that DOD could do a PowerPoint presentation about what they were going to do. It was an opportunity for us to say, and this is what Alaska thinks about it.
Which I think is important coming from a state like Alaska, where the military presence is so significant from the economic base. I don't think that military construction and DOD spending in Alaska is still 1/3 of the spending. The three-legged stool in Alaska, now it's probably a four-legged stool, and military spending is about a quarter of it, but it is still an extraordinarily significant part of our economic base in this state. And so to have the ability for your legislature to be convening, not from a regional perspective, Fairbanks versus Anchorage versus whatever, but having a venue where you can have these discussions about our military presence in the state of Alaska and what it means and how we integrate that with the Alaska civilian society. It's a big deal for us.
It is.
And I think it's been too easy over the years to just segregate it into will fights for Fort Wainwright and Eielson, and down here, you're fighting for J-Bear. But it's like saying the Port of Nome is an earmark for Alaska. No, it's an Arctic infrastructure for the whole country. Support for our military is not a Fairbanks thing or an Anchorage thing or a Coast Guard in Southeast thing. It's a statewide thing. And I think sometimes we tend to regionalize it too much.
100%. You mentioned Rand Paul, and you write about Rand Paul in your book. He's not the only person you write about in your book. In fact, I just want to say for folks out there who think this is some sort of political memoir that's going to be very careful, you're not that careful, and a great way for a reader, because you do name names, you tell things as they happen, you take what I would say are some real risks. And about the timing of the book, you speak very frankly about your relationship with President Donald Trump throughout the book. There are many parts where you're extremely critical. And I assume this book was pretty much done before he won re-election in 2024. Did you have any pause at all about releasing a book where you were basically rehashing all of the tumult between the two of you?
It's one thing to write the book. It's another thing to edit, right? Because you're editing at a time that is, okay, now months, maybe years have gone by from the episode, from the conversation, and you're looking at it and saying, all right, how is this playing out today? And believe me, I edited this book and thought about, okay, Trump could win this. And are you saying anything in here that you haven't already said? It was no great secret that I did not agree with Donald Trump throughout his first term. I mean, I voted to impeach him. And so I did look very carefully. There were some things that I think people are reading for the first time. The discussion in the Oval Office when Senator Sullivan and I were there, to this day.
He commented on your hair?
Yeah. It was really a fun It was really actually a very fun conversation with him. And a lot came from that. A lot came from that. But I didn't want this to be a gossipy tell-all about other people. And it's interesting. When I was interviewing different publishers, there were some who wanted to make sure that I was going to be open and unvarnished in my views of other people, whether it was Donald Trump or Sarah Palin or whomever. And I said, no, this is not about them. This is about me, this Alaskan senator who is operating in a pretty different environment than my home and my observations. But this is not me condemning Donald Trump necessarily.
Can I say another high wire act that I think you walk in this book? And that is the section about how you became a US Senator.
Yeah.
I was nervous for you in that section of the book.
I was terribly nervous, Tom.
I mean,
Oh my
talking
gosh.
about being appointed by your
Yeah.
father and about how people viewed that and how people viewed it in Washington. And I had never really thought about that, specifically John McCain. And you write about him being dismissive towards you when you were initially in office and comparing it with you. You mentioned Hillary Clinton coming up and saying, how are you doing, Lisa? How are things going?
Yeah.
You weren't getting that from a Republican in your own caucus.
I don't know that it was so much Republican versus Democrat. I think it was because of John McCain's lived experience. I have extraordinary high regard for John McCain and all of his contributions. And his story is legendary. Because of his father's rank, he was going to be released from the Hanoi prison before others. And he would not accept that. And so here I am. I have accepted a position that Alaskans had granted to my father. And he was going to convey that for the balance of his term. And I think John never said anything about it. It was what I felt. And maybe if John were still alive today and I could have that conversation, I would ask him directly. Maybe it was just my own sense of feeling like, what am I doing here? I don't belong here. I wasn't elected to be here. I'm filling somebody else's shoes. And so imposing on myself that sense of I haven't earned it.
And you talked a lot about your reluctance to take the position in the first place and about the extreme loneliness that you felt as this new senator in DC and feeling like you didn't belong.
My family was here in Alaska because we weren't going to uproot them for, if it was only going to be a fill-in for 2 years, it didn't make sense to bring everybody back. And so I didn't have that source of support. And I just, because I am that way, I just made myself work all the time. There was no breathing. There was no time for reflection. There was no time for, oh, let's go out and just go for a nice walk. It was a period of intensity. And I think maybe I didn't want to stop or slow down because then I would realize even more how lonely I was out there.
I want to bounce forward to the real-time reporting. You were working on the book when January 6th happened.
Yeah.
And that part of the book is very intense. And you wrote about texting your sons, Nick and Matt, that you love them during the attacks because you said, quote, I didn't know if I would ever see them again. And I think for so many people, they have some sort of weird amnesia about what happened in our country on that day. Yeah. And you also wrote about the PTSD that you don't use the words PTSD. I'm using PTSD.
It was absolutely PTSD. And
you had to have your hideaway. You chose to have a new hideaway office. You didn't want to go back in your hideaway office ever again. Mm-hmm. How do you make sense of so many folks moving on from that and excusing it? Some of your colleagues who were in the room with you who have minimized what happened that day.
I can't rationalize it. I cannot, because we were all there. We heard the same things. We saw the same things. And what happened in the Capitol on that day, it was an attack. You had individuals in that building who were there to create havoc, chaos, destruction, and potentially injury and death. Now, granted, you had some who did not start their day thinking that was what they would be engaged in, who were swept up in it, who literally saw a crowd and became part of it. But when you see violence within that crowd, you've got the choice of whether or not you continue with that and maybe even participate in that or move away from that. And what we saw, again, is something that you cannot paint over and say, oh, it wasn't so bad. A woman was shot. Officers were beaten. We lost an officer, a couple of them, who maybe not at the time, but it was real. And I am horrified that those who created the violence, who committed crimes, have all been pardoned, who were part of that insurrection. And it was an attack on the Capitol. It was an insurrection on the Capitol.
I'm grateful that you keep speaking about it and that you remain committed to the truth of what happened that day, because I feel like it's unfortunate that so many folks have forgotten.
What is interesting is after January 6th, there was a New York Times article. They wanted to do an interview with not just lawmakers, but other people who were there. And I was asked, and I sat for it, had a picture taken, made comments. And I was told afterwards that I was the only Republican in the Senate that was willing to participate, which I found stunning. And I think part of it was because there was already this fear or the concern that it would be viewed as you either thought that the election was legitimate or you believed Trump, that the election was stolen. And to me, the point of the matter is there was an attack on the Capitol, and we were there as witnesses.
When you talk about that, and you talk about it in the book, about you being surprised that you were the only Republican willing to sit for that interview, in your epilogue, you write about why you're a Republican. And you stated, because of your values, personal responsibility, small government, a strong national defense, and an individual's right to make her own choices. Honestly, as somebody who serves in the Alaska State House, I think that those values would align perfectly with the Democratic heavy majorities in both our House and Senate. And I sometimes align more with the far right. Actually, I see the PFD differently than some of my very fiscally conservative Democrat colleagues. I have a lower income district, and I know what the PFD means to poor people. And so I'm constantly fighting for that. So I think in Alaska, sometimes the words Republican and Democrat mean something completely different than they would in the lower 48. Mm-hmm. I just interviewed your former colleague in the Alaska State House, Andrew Halcrow, for the podcast. I asked him about being a Republican, and he talked about making a pact he vowed with a group of other Republicans years ago that they had not changed, the party had changed, and that he would never let go of being a Republican. Did you make that vow?
I never made a vow or a commitment, but I have been part of multiple conversations, whether with Andrew Halcrow, my dear friend, or others, where I've noted that the party has changed from when I first was active in the Republican Party. And believe me, it's been a long, long time. I was actually the finance director of the Republican Party for the state of Alaska back in 1980 something. But it has changed. And I don't think that's just a statement that is unique to me, to Andrew. Right now, is the Republican Party the party of Trump? Is the Republican Party MAGA? What is the Republican Party? We talk about being Reagan Republicans. How are we defining the Republican Party? And that's where I think it's better, instead of taking the label, define your values. And then you interpret where I fit. What a concept. This is why I love open primaries, by the way.
Open primaries are good, and you write about it in the book.
Mm.
Does it bother you when the Alaska Republican Party censures you?
No, it doesn't bother me when the party censures me. Everybody wants approval, right? But I look at the others that the Republican Party of Alaska has censured, and I count many of them as my good friends, and they are great, upstanding Alaskan citizens and good Republicans in their own right. It's just that they have failed to pass the purity test of a few select people within the Republican Central Committee. And my allegiance, I am a Republican, but I don't follow the directive of a party just to follow the directive of the party. I'm trying to do what is best for the people of Alaska. And the people of Alaska are not just Republicans. They're Democrats, they're independents, they're Green Party, they're libertarians. We have a wide mix. And of course, there are some 60% of them who choose not to affiliate with any party at all. And so if I'm going to be doing my job as an Alaskan to represent Alaskans in the United States Senate, I am going to try to be as open in my understanding, as clear as I can in how I'm communicating to them so that they can understand where I'm coming from. But it can't just be about blindly following the party. If that's what the people of Alaska want, they would select the chairman of the Republican Party to be their senator. So far as I know, they haven't done that. So it's hard because we're a two-party system in this country. But Alaska has always been a little bit of an outlier, even though our registration is almost 2-to-1 Republicans. Again, the vast majority of Alaskans choose not to affiliate with either of the two major parties.
Senator Lisa Murkowski, thank you so much for being on the show today. It's a great book. We barely graze the surface of a lot.
There's a lot in it.
There's a lot in it. The really, I think, a meaty part of the book is the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, the Me Too movement, your place in it. I think that part of the book is extraordinarily important. But when folks write a book like this, a lot of times people assume, are they running for president? Are they running for governor?
No.
Are they retiring? Like, the question is, does the book mean something beyond the fact that you've just written a book?
The easy answer to that is I've been waiting to tell the story about the write-in for so many years. And we are now 15 years beyond that. The timing of this was not to indicate anything other than it's about dang time that I got at least part of my story down in print.
I'll say something about the write-in campaign, because again, as a reader, something that kind of surprised me that I had never thought about was how your Senate colleagues, when you initially lost that primary, believed that you should endorse the person who won and be a good soldier, and that it was selfish for you to even think that you would somehow find another path, that a good Republican had won your primary, and that's the way it goes.
Yep. That's the way it is in Washington, D.C. And I get it. And that's why I held no grudges. I harbored no hard feelings for anybody who said, I'm gonna write a check to the guy who beat you because he's the Republican. The media companies, the consultants that had worked for us said, I'm sorry, I only worked for the Republican. You're still a Republican, but you're not the Republican nominee. And all of a sudden, I was in this status of total limbo, and I was an untouchable.
And you could have lost your seniority. I think that was something I didn't understand either.
They tried.
Yes. And I think it's crazy to say that there's suspense in a book where you know what's going to happen. But that part of the book is suspenseful because you really didn't know whether you should do it or not.
Oh, no, there was intellectually, you would say, no, of course you can't do it. It's not possible. Hasn't been done since Strom Thurmond in 1954. So intellectually, the answer was an easy one. And that was why what prevailed was not the polling. I didn't do polling. People don't believe I didn't do polling. I did not do polling. It was not that promises of money had been made because there weren't any. It was just the gut and the emotion of Alaskans who, I told some of the stories about the janitor in the airport, the waiter over at Kinley's, the woman on her bike over by Fire Island Bakery. I can't get those moments out of my head. But there were so many of them, and they were so genuine. And for me, this decision was 100% gut. Like real, honest Alaskans all over want me to do this. This is not about me needing to keep my job or being able to keep my stature or whatever. It was about giving them an opportunity. And if they were willing to take a risk on me, I was willing to at least give it a try. But it was 100% just plain old gut that says, we're gonna do this because there's some crazy kids running around on a broomstick in the park strip that think I can actually do this.
It's a real honest book, and I learned so much, and I'm so grateful that I read it.
I'm glad you read it.
I encourage people
Yeah.
to, and I hope you have a very Merry Christmas. Enjoy time with family, and thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@aklight.gov or call 907-269-0123.